Thank you very much, Katrina. So part of my thinking of this, recalling more 1916 than 1919 or 2016 commemorations, aspects of Tone's mission to France which are overlooked and overshadowed by the military dimensions. How had he projected an Irish nation to French decision makers, both political and military decision makers? Now, as you'll learn through the course of my talk about Tone, not about Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone is a name that people call this man after his death, and I associate that with the legend and the constructs and the cult and the distortions and misappropriations. So I have studied a lot and researched, published a lot. I'm going to try and put everything together for a more public, general readership. One of my last publications was on Tone's family life, because the last 2 years of his life in exile in France probably reconciled to the fact he was going to remain in France. He loved Holland, which was interesting. But that was his profession, that was his money spinning, that was his money earner. And there were times he was in the Rhineland, in what's now Belgium, what's now Luxembourg, what's now Holland. And by now his wife and children were safely installed in the Paris area. So there were a lot of letters toing and froing. And there were comments about the children. There were little postscripts to his oldest daughter, Maria. And these have been in the public domain since 1826. There were little nicknames. I think Tone had a lisp. So one of his children called him Fadoff instead of father. Well, it's in there, Fadoff, Fadoff. And in the letters he'd say, and the interesting thing is, I checked. This is a version of Tone's writings and life and diary that Pierce might have read. And it went straight to his heart. So I reconstructed a life, and I will pick up on that. I think it's very important to get to know the man in the context of his times, even though I do understand the cult that came up. Now, in January of this year, I was lucky to be in Dublin, and I took part, or I was present at a lot of the events for the first Dáil, 1919. And many people were discussing what was about to happen, the act of fealty, of loyalty that would have to be pronounced to the English sovereign in 1922. Now, I was hazy on that period, so I did my research. And of course, in that same oath, they were also swearing an oath to the new Irish Constitution. So this is nation building, and it actually goes back to this. And as a side distraction, which I became totally impassioned about, I taught a course for 3 years, which overlapped into the O'Connell era, and I learned an awful lot about those missing years of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And it also reminded me that this year is the 190th anniversary of Catholic emancipation in 1829, of civil liberties for Catholics in the political sphere. And again, we're going to see how this overlaps on that period. So, where indeed was the first Irish Republic in 1916? Of course, the first Irish Republic never came about, but there certainly was that vision. As you now know, in the National Museum, there's a lovely video on the internet of Brenda Malone, one of the curators in the National Museum, talking about the flag. They analyzed it, probably painted in Constance Markowitz's house in Surrey House, or Scurry House as they called it, with house paint. But what was the name of the guy who painted the flag? Theobald Wolfe Tone Fitzgerald. Oh yes, his parents were ardent patriots and nationalists. Now, this is such an ironic coincidence because in 2016, there was hardly a word recognizing the foundational moment of 1798, enshrined in Tone's writings. And I'll remind us of the importance of Tone's writings, which we mustn't forget survived, but have also been packaged. You can more or less find them in every library, in any bookshop. There's a huge imbalance because there are other important documents, more scattered, that other United Irishmen left behind, which deserve to be better known. In Tone's writings, there's the vision of a sovereign and democratic Irish nation. Eventually, the word republic is pronounced, of course, with their own flag. Now, that might account for there are more people in the arena than in the secret garden. Everyone, yes, was piked out in 1998. But that's not a reason to forget this period. And people were fearful building up to 2016. We don't want the same mistakes and errors of the previous bicentenary. And a lot of important stuff happened during the bicentenary of 1998. I decided, yes, I'm going to go do that PhD I wanted to do. But in any event, I'm just going to refresh our memories on that. The picture is quite emblematic of what the 1798 generation represented to the 1916 generation, which makes it all the more paradoxical that 1798 was overlooked in 2016. Sacrifice and heroism. Now, I finally had the courage last year, and I have a few photocopies, but you will go get thee to your local libraries in the September-October issue of History Ireland. I published, Tommy Graham, the editor, has what he calls a platform piece. And I got a little bit angry, eloquently, as convincingly as best as I could. Time to decommission Wolf Tone at Bodenstown. To me, the wolf encompasses some of the distortions. Now, firstly, he never was the founder of the United Irishmen in Belfast. He was a founding member. He helped write the documents. There are a lot of forgotten about Presbyterians. William Drennan needs to be resurrected. And I know that one of the reasons for that problem is that Tone's son, William, who published his writings in his preface, refers to him as the leader, the founder of the United Irishmen. So a big mistake. He not and never was the leader of the 1798 rebellion, but of course he was in the French army in Normandy in a French uniform in May 1798 when the rebellion breaks out. So in this quest for heroes, they're creating a movement. It's like Lord Edward Fitzgerald was commander-in-chief of the United Army. There was never such a thing. He was the military strategist. But it's interesting, this quest in the grammar for leaders, because Ireland was, of course, missing them. Now, he was, for a time, the main United Irish interface with the French Directory, for whom their military strategy, it suited them to envisage invading Ireland and helping an Irish revolution and helping establish, yet again, another independent republic in Europe. But he was not the only one. Edward Lewins is everywhere in the French archives, military archives, political archives, and yet he's forgotten about. Now, of course, Tone died on the 19th of November, 1798. So he had no opinions on the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty. He didn't take part in the 1950s border campaign. She's already done this. Now, by the way, just before I go to the next slide, I was unbelievably privileged a few years ago. Descendants, a great, 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 great granddaughter, owns that portrait, which was done not during his lifetime, but by his daughter-in-law, Catherine Sampson. And she was copying a portrait that he said, he referred to in a letter to his wife before the final expedition, where he gets on the boat and ends up in Donegal, and that's the end. In Brest, in Brittany, he has his portrait painted. So his daughter-in-law, who never knew him, copied it, obviously very gifted writer, and they sent me a disc from Minnesota or Michigan, wherever they live. There you go. Okay, so Sylvie had a little rant about Bodenstown in her article. To the left, a wonderful image of young Cumann girls. It's obviously post 1920-21. They're about to lay flowers, crosses, and probably say the rosary over his grave. But the real problem is to the right, the image to the right. So when you read my article, you'll see, and absolutely every single one of you, whether you live in County Kildare or not, are going to lobby public officials to get rid of the cement, the concrete, apart from the fact that it's ugly, it's Stalinist. They poured concrete over what would have been graves of Tone's family, of his neighbors. He lost a baby, himself and his wife, before they emigrated to America. Little Richard is probably buried there. Absolutely shocking. They poured cement over this with impunity, and they laid down plaques, one of them to Liam Mellows. What precisely does that have to do with Tone? So it's time to blow up all of this cement, metaphorically, and replace it with a garden and little plaques with the names of his children, of his family, cousins, and neighbors of his family, because this is hideous. It's an outdated 1970s. It wouldn't get planning permission today. Now, here we go. Tone left behind a vast corpus of writings, and most of them were published in 1826. More from his pen has been saved from oblivion than all the other United Irishmen put together. And we fast forward a little bit later to 1803. Robert Emmet left behind hardly any documents. Now, interestingly, this didn't prevent a legend from being shaped. But in 1803, Robert Emmet also issued a manifesto about what his uprising would be about, and hour-by-hour logistics of who should come to him. But there are other United Irishmen. The Shears left behind a proclamation. A lot of them are scattered. That's the problem. Tone had time to write. Firstly, he wrote a diary. He started writing it before his exile. So there's a lot about the foundation of the United Irishmen, and even a little bit petitioning for the rights of Catholics as secretary of the Catholic Committee. So he's traveling around Ireland, and there's an inn here, getting drunk there, a piper, so it's not uninteresting. But once he goes into exile in France, he has to stay in his lodgings, and he writes a lot. And it's survived. It's miraculous. There are few notebooks missing. There are key moments missing. But a lot has survived. So they were republished. So the interesting thing is, in the French archives, you have an extraordinary amount of proof that what he was saying in his diary in the evening, he was doing during the day. Going to this general, going to this military decision maker, going to this political decision maker, getting documents stamped, starting to put things preparation for when he's gone for his wife to maybe start getting a pension, something like that. So he writes about this in his diary. Did I make the right decision? Did this, and my poor wife, and where will she go if something happens to me? But it's all there in the documentation, so he's not making it up. And of course, in the diary, there's a lot of emotion. There you see, in a moment towards the end, I will speak about very briefly about William Drennan, a United Irishman who deserves to be remembered, a pamphlet he wrote on education. Now, when Tone was already commissioned in the French army, late summer 1796, and the Bantry Bay expedition is happening. Now, there's all sorts of hiccups and slowdowns, but he knows it's happening. And he has a lot of time. He's going to the port in Brest, staying in various towns on the way, in Rennes. He begins to write a memoir of his life. He had a lot of sense of humor. He called it Memorandums on My Life and Opinions, borrowing, of course, from Sterne. He's writing this memoir to amuse his sons when they grow up. But he knows I mightn't come back from this expedition. There you go. So that's a little bit, its grammar is very different from his diary, which is rushed and chaotic. Now, the memoir was published with the diary, but also political writings. And there's an iconic phrase in this memoir, as he's about to write, he's recalling, as he's about to write the argument on behalf of the Catholics of Ireland, which will transform Irish politics. So the very iconic phrase, which everyone knows, which has often been cited, which is probably, it's in the cement, in the concrete there, probably in Bodenstown, in the 1970s Bodenstown reshift. And recently I tripped across it, Irish Freedom, 1911. It was at the beginning of a political column. To subvert the tyranny of our execrable government, to break the connection with England, the never-failing source of all our political evils, and to assert the independence of my country. These were my objects. To unite the whole people of Ireland, abolish the memory of all past descendants, and to substitute the common name of Irishman in place of the denominations of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter. These were my means. You see the ordered thinking, because they had to train to speak and convince people. He was a lawyer. It's kind of nice to see it, all the neat grammar in writing. Now, of course, the religious labels, what they're saying is we're going to replace this with citizenship. Now, Tone wrote 2 influential documents that were republished by his son in 1826. Tone kept a copy of everything, which is very interesting. So he even numbered his letters to his wife. So he said, you know, I made a point in letter number 3 and you didn't answer it. Is Maria practicing her piano or whatever? But it's interesting because there are many. In fact, one of them a copy of something turned up at an auction in Bonhams in London in June. I nearly collapsed. And it was sold in private hands. It was a second copy of the address to his court-martial. Unbelievable. It's up there. You'll find it on the internet. Okay, so in the first memorial, he summarizes the political situation in Ireland, the divisions between the sects, the grievances, and of course he exaggerates the readiness to rise of the Irish and to join a French invasion. In his second memorial, he outlines the military and political strategy for this plan to succeed. All of this was reprinted in the public domain in 1826. Of course, now we have academic publications, where to find it in the French National Archives, where to find a copy in the French military archives. But his son William had copies in a trunk, and he republished everything 1826. And these documents are lobbying documents, and they're neglected. Now, I'm going to have a little bit of a rant. I have read the libel laws before coming down to West Cork. I was asked for the 4th time to partake in a documentary, getting emails, you're fabulous, you're wonderful, etc. Can you drop everything, go to France in the heat of July? Can you send us lots of your research? And of course, at the last minute, dumped. Eminent academics, retired, one of whom has been extremely supportive of my career. But the problem with documentaries, they have to compress everything. So I did an interesting exercise. And in September, I'm going to email Tom O'Connor, and he's going to try it with his undergraduates, 3rd or 4th years. I shut my eyes and I transcribed what was being said in the documentary. A lot of the 18th century dimension was incorrect. And then they pasted with images, and they conflated the terror and lots of guillotine with what Tone was doing in 1796. It was factually incorrect historically. It also distorts the French Revolution. The word bloody is always embedded. When Tone is in France, he never mentions the guillotine once, and I've looked and researched. They were only using it for convicted criminals. There was no terror anymore when Tone was in France. Now, So it's interesting to think of how these things are projected. Rome versus Republic opened a very valid conversation. Michael McDowell, who unashamedly uses the word republic, and we have some French visitors here, friends of mine, by the way. One of the big problems in 2016, did they invite any Italians? Did they invite any Americans? The ambassador just gave a very important talk. I missed most of it. Did they invite any French people to talk about how you build a republic? Zero. I think a lot of 2016 went very, very well, but it was still, not in a negative way, too insular, and to us and them just on the other side of St. George's Channel. So, of course, the Sorbonne did have a one-day conference on what they called the Atlantic Republics, and they looked at the ideas circulating in Tone's time and the project of an Irish Republic and how the American and the French had inspired them. Now, the first memorial was very selectively cherry-picked in this TV documentary. They implied that Tone equated Irish Catholics with Irish nationalism. And I was delighted that John, even more anachronistic in his period, nationalism, we really use this term for the 19th century. The big problem with the first memorial is that it totally, in the program, Rome versus Republic, it airbrushed out the dissidents. In other words, the Presbyterians, the enlightened Presbyterians, which would have been a problem because you would have had to interview Arlene with Michael McDowell on the same program. So what it does is it seriously misrepresents the reality in Tone's mind when he's representing all his United Irishmen in Paris in 1796. And he's not there on WhatsApp. He's remembering, he's had very little contact. He left Ireland, the island of Ireland, in June 1795. And he left via the north. And remember, they went to McCart's Fort and they pledged. So who were all those people there? The very last things they said to him, he's projecting this to the French. So he's recorded, he's frozen in time on paper, what we hope was representative of what all his fellow United Irishmen wanted to bring about. The program seriously misrepresented French decision-making and politics in 1796. It implies Tone was encouraging mob rule and brutal de-Christianization. It was quite shocking. There were pictures of what was going on, which was awful stuff. I should know, I'm half French, in 1793 and in 1794. They had satirical cartoons of that. But France, by 1796, had changed. Now, in his first memorial, and this was airbrushed out of the program, he said, the dissenters are sincere and enlightened Republicans. They support the establishment of unbounded liberty of conscience in France, mitigated their horror of popery. What he was saying was, the first 3 years of the French Revolution, don't forget, I'm going to reverse the situation Ireland knew in 1919, and Cosgrave saying, well, I looked it up. It doesn't mean I'm not the equal of the King of England just because I have to swear an oath of loyalty to him. The first 3 years of the French Revolution, it was a constitutional monarchy. And the king, in a ceremony, a huge, big, fabulous ceremony full of flags and events, swore an oath to the new French Constitution. And Marie Antoinette came, and with her little child, on behalf of the future king of France, swore an oath to the Constitution. That moment didn't last. But the unexpected coalition with Catholics between the Presbyterians and the Catholics of Ireland. This is one of the most beautiful phrases, led to a revolution in the political morality of the Irish nation. Nothing could exceed the alarm, the terror, and confusion which this most unexpected coalition produced in the breasts of the English government and their partisans, the Protestant aristocracy of Ireland. Sylvie has added, of whom there were some notable exceptions, of course. In 1791, Belfast and Dublin United Irish Clubs were founded, and he explains that similar clubs were spreading throughout Ulster. Ulster was the seat of dissenting power, and their object was to subvert the tyranny of England. Interestingly, the phrase, he already has it 4 or 5 months before it's in that iconic memoir. So we need to look back when the United Irishmen, 1794-95, before his exile, they're using this phrase. Maybe we'll find it before others. Establish the independence of Ireland and frame a free republic on the broad basis of liberty and equality. And Sylvie is adding civil liberties and equality between the sects. Obviously, all of this was too awkward for the Rome versus Republic documentary, as I've already explained. So they mention 0 of this, so it's hugely imbalanced. Tone did not equate Irish Catholics with Irish nationalism. That's really, you know, a post-famine setup. Okay, now in the second memorial, he explains the means most likely to separate Ireland from England and once again establish her as an independent republic in strict alliance with France. And he specifies a manifesto was to be published on the first landing declaring French intentions. They found copies of the one Ush would have circulated in 1796. And of course, when Humbert landed in Mayo, that has survived. An absolute disavowal of all idea of conquest. This is written as the armies are going through Italy and some new forms of conquest are happening. On the other hand, it's not an entirely black and white situation. The military in Italy are making a lot of decisions on the hop, but not everyone is objecting. It's the Italian aristocrats, it's the Italian church who are objecting. I have had the privilege of working with specialists of this period in France and in Italy. One of the big problems, you're not at all this morning, is that the manner in which European and French history is presented on well-funded British documentaries on TV, the vast majority of them have a spin. French historians mightn't present things the same way. Now, he also has a condition, a declaration of perfect security and protection to the free exercise of all religions, without distinction or preference, and the perpetual abolition of all ascendancy or connection between church and state. This is the beginning of our modern states. He is not calling for brutal de-Christianization. Again, we don't actually 110% know what his own views were on religion. In that little chapter I published in a series of essays on Irish childhood, I make the comment that in the lively and very heart-wrenching letters between himself and his wife, he's beginning to say, and towards the end he says, they may only have one parent. I completely trust you to bring them up. It's a very important moment of equality between a mother and a father, between a husband and wife. And then there's spirited little outbursts about the children and their nicknames. Never once does he say, are they saying their prayers? Have you found an Anglican service somewhere in Paris? There was one in English. He never mentions the religious education of the children ever. Now, once a national convention was formed, interesting, and there's an interesting echo with the 1916 proclamation. We're a temporary government, a provisional government, but soon we will have elections and then the people of Ireland will decide. Once a national convention is formed, we will form an alliance, offensive and defensive. We'll never get to know what he meant by that. An offensive and defensive with the French Republic. And a treaty of commerce on terms of mutual advantage. And that's one of the main reasons why people in Ireland would not have let go of Ireland. They promised the French to use the harbour, the port of Cork. Too lucrative. There's no way they would have given that up. Now, The Irish people are prepared and united and want nothing but the means to begin. Of course, he's chancing his arm here. Now, in the article I published, and I'm going to it's in French, I'm going to republish it in English. I quoted an obscure document called An Address to the People of Ireland on the Present and Important Crisis. The word crisis. At this moment of crisis, Tone is writing a lot about his identity. Tom made that very important point this morning, albeit in another period of time. So there's a copy in the French National Archives. He kept his own copy. His son reprinted it. It's been in the public domain since 1826. Now, it's long. It's arduous. Out of 16 pages in a printed edition, I think when I was teaching undergraduates, I gave them 10 lines at the most. It would never have been an effective communications document on landing. That was the whole point. But it's worth some consideration. Writing it was probably a form of therapy because he does let go. It's beautifully worded. The grammar, the syntax, there's not a word that doesn't have a meaning and resonate. But it's really a bit too dense and complicated. I'm sure it was a form of therapy for him. I'm about to get on the boat. Maybe this is going to happen. Now, interesting things that I've just extracted from it. The doctrine of republicanism will finally subvert that of monarchy and establish a system of just and rational liberty on the ruins of the thrones of the despots of Europe. Okay, he gets a bit into symbolic language. We need to remember that one of the grievances of in Ireland was the middle classes who had cash but couldn't buy land. And the lower middle classes who had worked and didn't wake up one morning in one of the Downton Abbeys of Ireland resented the aristocracy who were born into privilege. So these were the ideas of Tom Paine that were circulating, very popular, 1794-ish. Admission to the legislature will no longer be purchased by money. It will be the interest as well as the duty of a national government to redress the grievances of the peasantry and to enlighten their minds. The top will look after the bottom. The beginning of state decision-making, of national institutions. So the two speakers this morning were just on the cusp of that period, just when centralized government is really beginning to matter, and then you no longer have an excuse not to look after your people. Final section of the quotes. And this was, how did I ever get this translated into French? Thankfully, someone else peer-reviewed it. But anyway, the unnatural union between church and state, which has degraded religion, he's actually defending religious practice, into an engine of policy will be dissolved. Tithes, the pest of agriculture, will be abolished. The memory of religious dissensions will be lost, when no sect shall have an exclusive right to govern their fellow citizens. Each sect shall maintain its own clergy, no citizen. You see, this is an overarching concept now. Will be disfranchised for worshiping God according to his conscience. He's not seeking to de-Christianize Ireland by any means. He's seeking the modern system that we know. This we really like. You could even almost fit it into a tweet. Every man shall rank in the state according to his merit and talents. It's a society of meritocracy. Now, you have to admit, maybe the conquest was a good thing. We see what Irish people do with the English language. What a fine writer. We shall be a nation, not a province, citizens, not slaves. Obviously, this is very problematic when you get into the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s period, when my beloved O'Connell, when they're using the metaphor of slavery, it's awful. I know undergraduates, you'd kind of have silence in the seminar room. They're not impressed with this metaphor. But here it's eloquent. It gives a balance. Our commerce shall extend into the four corners of the globe. Our flag shall be seen on the ocean. Our name shall be known among the nations. And that's in a document that's never cited. It was reprinted, but it's never cited. So, again, Tone's diary was widely read. It made him very familiar. It's sad at times. It's despondent. It's angry. It's Anglophobic. So you can understand how in the 1940s and 50s, people just pluck out different phrases. It's also extremely funny. It's optimistic. It's rambling. It's precise. Okay, she needs to say it. I'm giving the talk before lunch, but very often he says, I'm writing this after dinner. And he underlines it, which means he's had several glasses of wine. It's often very precise, it's focused, it's unbelievably eloquent, it's very sentimental and moving at times. He talks about the friends he's left behind. Even when his family are in France, he talks about Ireland and the Wicklow Mountains and the beautiful, he misses Ireland. It's also very rational, and globally it's highly entertaining. It's a very fine example of 18th century confessional writing where he talks about himself and he draws, and his mistakes, and he draws readers into his hopes, into his despairs. He takes them along on his travels and on his adventures. Again, many expressions of homesickness for Ireland. He talks about daily life in France, and there's a lot he doesn't talk about. He doesn't mention the guillotine once. He embeds many quotations from Shakespeare and other obscure plays, so little light-hearted operettas and comedy. He's frequently cited by many of the 1916 generation, and I have a wonderful sample in a moment. And all his humanity, all his flaws, and all his strengths are apparent. So I used to have an allergy to Pierce's speech at Bodenstown, and now I fully understand it. I think it's absolutely majestic because it appeals to the emotion of the people listening to him. I think Pierce was probably a very effective speaker. And he recreates the image of Tone lying on his deathbed, thinking of his children. And everyone must have said, that's it, we're going to go out and revenge him. Now, in his diary, there's often a bit of drama. And that's what we need. We need entertainment. So this, by the way, I worked on a project in Trinity. It's somewhere up on the internet, on the Trinity website. It was published in the Irish magazine, Waddy Cox's, in the very early 1800s. That is the dramatic defense of Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Now, it's just, he's virile, look at that. He nearly succeeds. And, you know, we don't have that many illustrations, book illustrations from that period. But we're going to get a little bit of drama now, and then we'll conclude on a serious note. So Tone is in Paris. He's not yet commissioned in the army. He's still treading over eggshells, but he has a lot of friends in the right corridors, including James Monroe, the American ambassador. And a law has been just issued ordering all foreigners to leave Paris unless they have a residence permit. And he gets it. He has his residence permit. But there's an admin hiccup. So the local police come to his lodgings. So he writes in his diary. And this is in the middle of all other things. It's in a paragraph embedded. Yesterday I had a visit from the commissaire de police, and he writes it in French, of my section by order of the Bureau Central of Paris in order to bring me before my betters for remaining in town contrary to the law of 21st Floréal, which was the 10th of May, concerning strangers. They use the word strangers for aliens and foreigners. Now, in his written diary, italics had dotted underlining. This was when a printer sees this in a manuscript, please put this in italics for emphasis. The Irish Times no longer uses italics. However, I jumped suddenly upon him and deprived him of the use of his weapon by producing my permission to remain, signed Carnot, on which he begged me pardon, etc. He then wrote, you know, a report of it, and we signed and we parted the best of friends. Of course, he's on his own in his lodgings at night. He's writing a blog for himself about what happened during the day. So that must be from some play that he saw or a novel that he read. He's just amusing himself. But he also amused later generations. Hang on to your seats. Joseph Mary Plunkett writes a diary. He's on his way to Germany to hook up with Roger Casement. So is it what, May, June 1915? And he's at the Swiss border, about to enter Germany. And this was reprinted by his great niece. And I've emailed with her, I've met her. She said, I didn't have the faintest idea when I was transcribing his diary what he was on about. The Swiss authorities on the customs made the usual perfunctory inquiries and to my surprise asked to see my passport. I produced it and replied to his question as to whether I was English by a most vigorous denial and an assertion that I was Irish. Next, he stated that I ought to have had it stamped, visé, by the Swiss something or other, which I had, of course, omitted to do, but I jumped suddenly upon him and deprived him of the use of his weapon, stating that I had not been told that was necessary. He then hemmed and hawed and graciously permitted me to depart. He enters Germany and meets up with Roger Casement. I checked. It's verbatim, the exact phrase that Tone had in his diary. Isn't that beautiful? Did he bring it with him to Switzerland? Doesn't matter. Maybe he had it in Berlin. He remembered the phrase. And Joseph Mary Plunkett amused himself. He's very nervous. He's very angst-ridden, the same as Tone was. Bit of humor. Now, Geraldine Plunkett Dillon explains to her granddaughter, Tone's diary was Plunkett's Bible. Okay. I have tried to think to myself, Tone is mitching around France. He's in the corridors of power. He's in the army. There's lots of time in camps. Am I going to settle in France? Now, he's worried with his wife that his kids are forgetting their English. There's a few mistakes. Don't neglect their English, but of course they're learning French and German, which will be useful to them. So multicultural, multilingual. Tom and John would have encountered a lot of this. But you see, one of the distortions about the bloody French Revolution is that a new society was being constructed with culture, with education. They were making copies of statues in the Louvre, and plaster copies were being brought to provincial towns. New institutes, now obviously military academies and engineers, but education was being spread, literacy. The children have health problems, so they swim in the river Seine. And he tells his wife, be very careful, only a safe spot. But I looked it up. They were encouraging girls to learn to swim as well. He doesn't say anything about his daughter learning to swim. Possibly more important, land was being sold off. The estates of aristocrats and of the Catholic Church. There's now a website in France. Look up your peasant ancestors who were able by 1800 to buy a field. France was in many ways a more modern, yes, institutionalized country. And for all the faults of Napoleon, the image I showed you early on was General Bonaparte. He's not Napoleon yet. Just like I heard the word British used this morning for the 1500s. We should really only say English. In any event, Napoleon had emancipated the Jews, the Protestants, and education was being promoted. It was a new modern society. There you go. Educate so that you may be free. A horrible day, the Charlie Hebdo march in Dublin. Someone had brought a French tricolour, and in the background, you see, of course, our wonderful National Library of Ireland. There you go, folks. Thank you very, very much.